TanStack Query is one of the most famous JavaScript libraries out there. In fact, one of every 6 React projects uses TanStack Query, and I practically use it in all of my projects. So in this video, I want to give you a complete introduction to TanStack Query and how you can use it to bring your React application to the next level. So we're going to start with the basic building blocks, which are queries and mutations. Then we'll move to more advanced topics like how to handle query interdependencies and how to implement pagination and optimistic updates. So what is TanStack Query? TanStack Query concentrates on one single problem: managing server state. Imagine you have a simple application that uses some data from a server. In such a scenario, you will find yourself writing code to fetch data, manage loading states, handle errors, and update the state accordingly. This can quickly become complex and lead to repetitive code across your components. Plus, if you're using the same data in multiple places in your UI, you will somehow have to share it between these components without making multiple requests. React Query simplifies this whole process by providing a set of very powerful hooks. It also takes care of caching, background updates, and stale data management, allowing you to focus on building your application's core functionality instead of worrying about other things like race conditions. So without further ado, let's get to it. So this is the application that we will be building today. This is a contact book. So you have a list of contacts, and it also has multiple pages. You can click on a contact and you can see it loads the information about that contact, like the phone number and the address. You can also add a new contact, John Doe, and give it a number, for example, and an address. And as you can see here, we have our newly created contact. You can see the details. And we also have data validation. So if you don't fill these fields that are marked with an asterisk and click on create, you will get an error. We also have a server application running in the background, and this error comes from the server and shown here for the user. And of course you can edit a contact, so you just click here and the data is loaded from the backend, and you can change the first name. Let's just write first and click on save. And here you can see also that the third entry has been updated. All right, let's jump into the code. So here I have this project where I have a backend and a front end. So in the backend, we have all the functionality that we need, like saving contacts and getting contacts. In the front end, this is just a React project. And I also have a client that can make the API calls to the backend. So here we have get contacts, which just makes a fetch request to the backend and returns the result. It also has TypeScript type definitions so that we have the types throughout the application. So the first thing we want to do is to get the contacts and show them this list. So in React Query, this is called a query. So basically getting the data from the backend. And to do that, we can go inside our app. And here we have our contacts table. So here we should display the contacts. So let's just go ahead and install TanStack Query. I'm going to open a new terminal, npm install @tanstack/react query. And once that's done, we can go to our entry point. So here, this is main.tsx, and this is where app is rendered. And what we need to do is to just wrap this inside a query client provider. And this is going to come from TanStack Query. So import from @tanstack/react query. So query client provider. And this expects one prop, which is the query client. So let's create that. Client equals new query client. And we're going to pass it here. I'm missing a T over here. So let's jump to the contacts table, which is what is shown here. And here we can query the contacts from the backend. So to do that, we can just write use query. And we need to import this from TanStack Query. And useQuery gets an object with the options. So here we can define how to get the data. For that, you can use the query function. And this is just going to use the client that we already have and call getContacts. And getContacts expects a page number, so we can just pass 1 for now. And the other option that we have to provide is the query key. So the query key is used to identify this query. It's also used in the cache, so it should be different for each query. So here we can have contacts. And useQuery returns an object which has a lot of useful properties. And the most useful one is the data property. And this contains the data that is going to be loaded from the backend. So we can display the data here. So data.contacts, and we can map the contacts. So for each contact, we can show a contact table row, which is a component that I already have defined before. And this receives a contact, the instance of the contact, and the key is going to be the ID. Let's also import this. And now you can see that the contacts are shown. If I change the page number here to 2, this should load the second page. Now we also have these 2 callbacks here that are used. So when the user clicks on the contact name or edit button, that these are called. These are used to open the model. So I'm just going to pass them here. So now when you click on this, the details is shown. Of course, this doesn't work yet. We're going to implement this next. And we click on edit. This should also be editable and should be pre-filled with the contact data. One of the best practices when using useQuery is not to use it directly like this in your component, but to define a custom hook. So for that, we can just go in our API folder and create a new file. I'm going to call this hooks.ts. I'm just going to take this part here, the useQuery hook. And here we can define a custom hook. And here we can call this useContacts. This is going to be a function that calls useQuery. Let's import useQuery and the client. And also export it from here. And now in the contacts table, you can use contacts. And it still works like expected. A very common pattern when having a list of items is to use pagination. So you get the items page by page. Here we have hard-coded page 2, but this should be a parameter. So let's see how to pass parameter to queries. I'm going to start by defining the parameter. So I'm just going to use a normal state, and I'm just going to call this page number. And I'm going to use a component from Mutation, and it's called Pagination. So here we can pass the value, which is going to be the page number. On change, which is called when the user selects a new page number. So set page number, and it also gets a total amount of page. I'm just going to say 100 for now. And here in set page number, we can set it to 1 as an initial value. And when I save, you can see we have our pagination down here. Of course, the total is not 100, but you can get from this data. We also get from the backend the total items count. So it's going to be data.total pages. And if we don't have data yet, I'm just going to say 0. Now this is not working yet because we still haven't passed page number to the function making the call. So let's just pass page number. And I'm going to go inside use contacts and add page number as a parameter, which is going to be a number. Now when I click, you can see that actually it still doesn't work. And the reason for that is because our query key is still the same for both pages. In order to fix that, you should actually always put all your parameters inside the query key. So that way, when the page number here changes, the query key is going to be changed and React Query is going to make a new query. And now when I click on 2, you can see that it's loading and then loading the correct page. We still didn't implement the loading state, and that's actually very easy to do. We can just add a is loading, or is pending is actually the correct one. And we can check if is pending. We can return our loading state. So now when I click on page 2, you can see that it's loading and then it shows the results. Page 3, same thing. But if you click on page 1 again, you're going to see that it's not going to be loading again because the data is already there and it's already cached on the client. Now let's go ahead and add the case where we receive an error from the server. So I'm going to go to the backend server and just stop it. Now if I reload the page, you're going to see that it's going to be stuck in loading. And the reason for that it takes so long to load is because when there's an error, TanStack Query is going to try 3 times with different intervals to check if it's possible to still get the data without showing the user an error. And of course, we're not showing an error because we're still not handling it here. But we can go to where we use our hook and use the isError property. So if error, then we can return an alert with the title error loading contacts. And you can see it here. We can also add a button and with some text like retry. And when it's unclicked, we can retry the query again. Here we can also grab retry or refetch, it's called, and pass it to the button. So on click, call refetch. Now we wait that it's loading. And now we have this button. We can also color it red. But now if I click retry, it's going to be retrying again. So let's go ahead and start the backend again. And you can see that it has retried the query again. So now that we have created our first query, we can go ahead and also implement loading the details of a given contact. So we have here this component, contact details model, and it has some dummy data here. And here we can also use a new custom hook for that. So I'm just going to copy and paste this. And this is going to be use contact without an S. And it's going to receive a contact ID as a parameter, which is going to be a string. And I'm going to pass it here. Now I'm seeing that the structure of query key is a bit clashing. So what we can do is to change it here and add, for example, list. And here we can add 1. And you can think of this like a URL with sections or something like that. So we have contacts, list, page number, or contacts 1, contact ID. And here we can use the client, get contact. So now that we have our custom hook, I'm going to jump back to the model and import it. And I'm going to pass here selected contact ID. And we can grab the data from here this time. Let's import this from API hooks. And I'm getting an error because this prop can be either undefined or strings. So when the user didn't click on a contact yet, it's going to be undefined. And when the user clicks on a contact, it's going to be a string. So to fix this, we can go to our hook and add, of course, either string or undefined. And now we're going to have another problem that the client expects a contact ID. And one way to go around this is to disable the whole query when there is no contact ID. So we can just pass in another parameter and say that it's enabled when there is a contact ID. And here we can also add an exclamation point to say that we're sure that the contact ID is defined. Here we're getting also this problem that data can be undefined, and this is the case when the data is still loading. So I'm just going to wrap everything inside data and now when you click on it, it's shown. We still need a loading state, and we can just put it inside this model. So is pending. If it's pending, then show the spinner. Now let's click on another contact. You can see that it's loading. It's also cool to see that if you close this modal and click again on the same contact, is going to be shown directly because we still have the data in the cache. Now, before moving on to mutations, I just want to touch one last point, which is query interdependencies. So when you have a query that relies on the data from another query. And the way to do this is pretty straightforward. We're also going to be using this enabled flag, and you're going to see how this works. So in this example, I have a country code. Here it's for Germany, DE. And this is used to render this image here. And I'm using this website, flag CDN, where you could just pass a country code and you receive an image. So the challenge here is to use the phone number that we have from the user. And using the phone number, we can get the country from the backend. And once you have that country, we can pass it here to load the image. So I'm going to go ahead and create another hook for that. So a new hook, I'm going to call this use number country code. And this is going to get a phone number as an input. It's going to be a string or undefined. And this is also going to use query. So let's just add a query key. It's going to be phone number code with the phone number as a parameter, and also a query function. So we're just going to be using our client function, client.getCountry. Since this is either a string or undefined, we only want this to be active or enabled when there is a phone number. Now we can come back to our model and use our new hook. So use number country code, and here we can pass in the result from the previous query. So data.phone number, and from here we can grab the result. This is gonna also be called data, but we can rename it like this and just call it phone number data. And now I can come to our image and I can check if phone number data is already loaded. So phone number data and image, and the country code is going to be phone number data that code, and I'm also going to make it lowercase to just suit the API. And now you can see when I click on an item, wait a little bit, and then it's shown. And this way you can easily mix and match queries because it's super flexible. And one last cool query feature is the select option. So here we have this 100 contacts title, but actually this is just hard coded, and it's hard coded here. And actually we do need to know how many contact items we have from the backend. And for that we can reuse the same endpoint as before, which is this use contacts. Now there are two ways we can use this in our component. We can just import use contacts directly in our component like we did before and check how many contacts we have, or we can use the select option. And this select option is basically just a function that receives the data and applies a transformation to it. So here we can call data.total contacts, which is a number. The advantage of using select is that it's very performant. So when the output of the select function doesn't change, the component doesn't re-render. And here we're using use contacts in the two different places. So what we can do is to have a select option that we can pass it to use contacts. And this is going to be a function that receives the data, which is get contacts response. and returns something like a new type. I'm going to call this T, and we can use generics for this. So we can define the type T, and then we can pass in the select here. Now this is actually optional, so we don't always have to pass in select. And by default, we want this T to be defined as the get contacts response in the case that we don't provide a select option. So if we go to our contacts table, we don't have any TypeScript error. But now when we go to the app component and import use contacts, I'm going to say page 1 because it doesn't matter. And here we can call data.total contacts. And now that we have the number of contacts that we have, we can also display it here. Let's reload the page. I'm sure we're going to have it undefined and then contacts. So here we can check if we have data, and if not, we can just have an empty string. So I'm going to reload the page and it looks pretty good. Okay, so we are done with our queries. Let's now move to mutations. First thing we want to do is to implement this add contact formula. So when the user fills this contact and clicks on create, we want to have some kind of loading state here. And then the contact is created in the background in the server. So I'm going to jump to the create new contact model. And here, as you can see, we already have a use state that has our form state, first name, last name, phone number, and the address. And these are passed to our text input. So when they change, the value is saved inside the state. And here I'm going to create a new hook. So use create contact. Let's just do it directly inside our hooks file. So const use create contact. It's going to be a function, and this is going to call use mutation. So a mutation is just an operation that changes data. So in this case, creating a contact, but it could also be editing a contact or deleting a contact. So I'm calling use mutation, and this just needs a mutation function, very similar to the query function. And here we can call our client dot create contact, and this expects a parameter, which is create contact request. So I'm just going to add it here to the mutation function and pass the contact to the function. I'm also going to import this. So now we have this use create contact, and we can use it inside our component. So use create contact, and this is going to return an object again, and it has a field called mutate, which is the function that we can call to perform the operation. And it also has the fields is pending, which we can also use in the button. So we have this button with an on-click listener on save click. And when this is called, we're going to call mutate with the given state. So here it's going to be form state. And when it's pending, I'm also going to pass this to the button to show that it is pending. So loading is equal is pending. So let's click on add contact, and I'm just going to write first name, last name, some phone number, and some address. And when I click on create, so we can see that it's loading, but we don't get any feedback that it has been successful. So the way we can do that is head over to our custom hook and pass in a function on success. And the use mutation hook also has an option for that on success. And this is going to be passed here. And this is just going to be a normal function. And I'm also going to make this optional because you don't have to always listen for this event. And here we can pass in our function. And what I'm going to do here is just to close this modal. Now, when you create a new user, and let's add a phone number and click on create, you can see it's loading. And once it's created, the modal is closed. But as you can see, we also have a new problem now, which is that we cannot see the contact that we just created. So if I reload the page, then you can see it. And the problem is that React Query doesn't know that this data has changed. So what we can do here is that when the query is successful, we can call a special function from TanStack Query to invalidate the query that has changed. So here I'm going to wrap everything inside these curly brackets and return the mutation. So it's just like before, but now I'm going to use query client hook from TanStack Query, query client. And this has a method that we can call in on success. So I'm going to call the past parameter first, and we can call query client dot invalidate query. And here we can pass in a query key. So in this case, we can just pass in contacts, and this needs to be an object. So query key is contacts. So what this does is that it invalidates all queries that start with contacts, and this is going to be the use contact and use contacts because they all start with contacts. The number country code is not going to be invalidated, so it stays the same. Now, what does invalidate query actually do? So when you invalidate a query, it just means that next time that you're using that query, TanStack Query will make the request to the backend and not use the cache. So now let's try creating a new contact. I'm going to call this new contact, pass in a phone number, click on create, and now you see that it also updates this list. Now, what happens when the user doesn't fill all the fields? So here I didn't put in any front-end validation, so the fields are also required by the backend. So if you don't fill the fields and click on create, there's going to be some kind of error from the backend, but we need to somehow show it to the user. And the way we can do this is by grabbing the attribute error and use it in the front end to display our errors. So I'm just going to come here to the end before we have our buttons and check if we have an error. Then let's just show error.message and see what happens. I'm going to click on create, and you can see first name is required. Now this error comes from the backend, and now it's shown to the user, which is a really cool thing. Now instead of just showing some plain text, we can also show an alert from Mountain, and now it's very clear that it has been an error. So let's fill in the first name, Yusuf, new, and click on create. You get an error, last name is required. I'm gonna write my last name. If I click on create, you get a new error. Phone number is required. Of course, a best practice would be to check this on the front end, but in case you get any kind of error from the backend, it's at least shown to the user. So this is really cool user experience. One cool feature that you can also implement with TanStack Query is optimistic updates. So what are optimistic updates? Optimistic updates means we don't wait for the server to respond before showing feedback to the user. For example, when a user creates a new contact, we can already show it in the given list, or when the user has edited a contact and closed this model, we can already show the new contact information here. So let's go ahead and implement that. There is this component, which is this edit model, and it's implemented very analogous to the create new contact. It just uses a query to set the initial value of the model. And here what we want to implement is that when the user clicks on edit, changes something, clicks on save, and then closes the model, then he should already be able to see the new name. And the way we want to do that is to go to this mutation hook. And here we have the mutation where we edit the contact. And what we need to do is to provide a mutation key that differentiates this mutation from others. And here I'm just going to call this edit contact. And of course, we need to be sure that we're talking about the same contact. So I'm also going to pass in a contact ID. Let's add this to our parameters. So now that we have the mutation key, we can go ahead and create a new custom hook. Let's just call this use optimistic contact name. And this is going to receive a contact ID, which is a string. And this hook just returns the new contact name that the user wrote inside the edit model. So for this, we can use mutation state, which is another hook from TanStack Query. And we can pass in a filters, And here we can say that we want the mutation key to be equal to the one that we have in the other mutation. And I also want to check that the state is pending, so it's still happening. And this returns a list of mutations. These are all the mutations that fit this criteria. The mutation key and the status is pending. And here we can check if we have a first element. So first mutation is going to be mutations at 0. And if we have one, then we can return the first mutation that variables. And this is what we have passed here inside the mutation function. This is going to be a contact. Let's just create a variable for that, contact, and then we can return contact that first name plus contact that last name. And of course, if it's not the case, we can just return undefined. And now we can use this hook inside our table component. So we have the contact table row, and inside of here, we can have this use optimistic contact name and pass in the contact.id. So we can make a variable out of this optimistic contact name. I think we need to export this function. So let's just go to the hooks and export. And now we can import it here. And so now when we have this optimistic contact name, we can display it here. So let's check if we have an optimistic contact name, then display it. Otherwise, we can use the contact at first name plus the contact dot last name. And let's check if this works now. I'm going to come to this first contact and change the last name. Let's call it 2 and click on save. I'm going to close this fast, but you can see it's still not working. And the reason for that is that we changed the other hook that is used inside the model. We have added another parameter, which is the contact ID. So we can come here and just pass in the edit contact ID. And let's try it again. Click here. I'm going to write 3, click on save, close it fast, and you can see that the update is already there. And there you have it, optimistic updates. So I hope that you enjoyed watching this video and see you in the next one.